I'm Abdala and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. My research focuses on how the brain generates breathing and controls it, and I'm interested in a number of conditions where breathing is disrupted, one of them including Rett syndrome. Over the years, my team has used mouse models to try and understand the breathing disturbances and try and find treatments for them. But today I will be focusing on the more practical aspects regarding the breathing dysfunction. The most described breathing problem in people with Rett syndrome are apneas. So apneas are defined as a cessation in breathing. When the person with Rett syndrome is awake, central apneas are the most common. So these happen when the brain stops generating the effort to breathe that contracts the diaphragm, and therefore the breath is absent. Central apneas can also happen during sleep, but in people with Rett syndrome they are usually a lot less frequent than when they are awake. During sleep, obstructive apneas and hypopneas are more common. Obstructive apneas occur when muscles in the soft tissue on the back of the throat collapse during sleep, causing a blockage in the upper airway. This means that air doesn't move into the lungs, even though the chest muscles and the diaphragm may still be contracting. If the blockage is only partial and stops airflow by about half, this is considered a hypopnea. So how common is it for people with Rett syndrome to experience apneas when they are awake? The natural history study tried to establish that. They followed 778 females with classic Rett syndrome for up to 9 years. They found that over the lifetime, it was estimated that about 9 out of 10 people with typical Rett syndrome would develop a breathing problem at some point in their lives. The plot on this screen shows on the vertical axis the percentage of participants suffering from apneas. And on the horizontal bars, you can see the percentages in different age groups. So this data suggests that the prevalence of apneas in adults may be lower than in younger ages. So we know that apneas are very common in people with Rett syndrome, but are they actually harmful? Transient abnormal breathing is not necessarily bad for the health, as long as it does not change blood gases and the heart rate. However, early data shared by the STARS clinical trial revealed that people with Rett syndrome can experience periods of abnormal blood gases. So this study used an at-home recording device to record people for 6 hours over a period of 3 days. They were able to do these recordings in 102 study participants. So this plot is some of the early data that they shared. And you can see here on the vertical axis the number of episodes per hour. And the column on the left are the apneas, those are periods where breathing stops for longer than 10 seconds. And the column on the right are the blood oxygen saturation. So these are periods where it was below 90%, so this is considered clinically worrying, clinically relevant. The dots here on those columns indicate the maximum, the minimum, and the median, with the median being a point that where 50% of the participants were either above or below it. So you can see for oxygen saturation, for low oxygen saturation, actually not a large number of participants showed worrying levels of low oxygen saturation. So the episodes were very infrequent. So you can see that there have been a number of large studies investigating the breathing dysfunction that happens when people with Rett syndrome are awake. However, studies looking at the sleep breathing disturbance are fewer, and they also have enrolled a smaller number of participants. But recently, this group here on the screen published a meta-analysis where they took information from all these different smaller studies that were performed looking at the breathing disturbance at night, and they performed a new statistical analysis based on the data combining all these different studies. So we have information then that is grouped for a larger number of participants. And what they found was that sleep apneas are also very prevalent, very common in people with Rett syndrome, and quite often they can be of a severity that warrants clinical intervention. So this table here on the screen shows you the apnea-hypopnea index. So these are periods where breathing stops or is insufficient. And they compared, many of these studies had comparisons with age-matched neurotypical controls. So you can see here on the middle column the expected values for somebody who's neurotypical and the values that they found through this new analysis using a larger group of patients with Rett syndrome. So we have covered the different types of breathing dysfunction in Rett syndrome and how common they are and their severity. But what causes them? The breathing dysfunction, especially the one that happens during wakefulness, is caused mainly by the abnormal development of the brainstem due to the lack of MACP2 protein activity. So the brainstem is the part of the brain that controls the breathing muscles in the body. So this includes the muscles in the chest and also in the upper airways. Although this abnormal brainstem development will also contribute to the breathing dysfunction during sleep, there are other factors that can contribute to this that are independent of having Rett syndrome. So they are also risk factors for obstructive sleep apnea in the neurotypical population, and this includes being over the age of 40. So we know that as we age, the risk of having obstructive sleep apnea increases directly with age, and it's almost ubiquitous in people over 90. Having a narrow airway, such as large tonsils, adenoids, or a tongue, having nasal congestion, or a small lower jaw. So these are things that can affect children who are neurotypical and can also cause disordered breathing during sleep in neurotypical children. Having a severe scoliosis, so that is another thing we know is very common in Rett syndrome, especially those very severe scoliosis angles. They compromise the functioning of the breathing muscles in the chest and the volume of the lung, and they can make disordered breathing during sleep more common too. Being overweight or having too much fat around the neck, so this is not necessarily a common problem found in Rett syndrome, but it's something to watch out for that can increase the risk. And taking certain medicines, so particularly those that have a sedative effect that depress the brain, such as sleeping tablets, anti-anxiety medications, and some of the anti-epilepsy medications. So again, those types of medications can be common in the population with Rett syndrome, and it is a risk factor to watch out for. Of course, the best treatment for the breathing disorder in Rett syndrome would be gene therapy to reestablish the function of the MACP2 protein in the brainstem. But while this is not available, there are other ways where breathing symptoms can be managed, either with devices or not using drugs or through drugs. The treatment will always be prescribed by a specialist, only after a diagnostic assessment. The sleep breathing disorder is probably the easier one to manage compared to the awake breathing dysfunction, although these devices have been used to help both. So there are various types of intervention listed here in your screen, as you can see, and they have all been used to manage the breathing disorders in Rett syndrome, and you can see the references on the right there. However, most of these studies were done in small groups of participants, and they weren't really designed to evaluate efficacy. However, common sense indicates that most of these interventions are likely to be useful for managing the breathing disorder in Rett syndrome, as they are indeed used to manage a sleep breathing disorder in people who are neurotypical with excellent efficacy. So some of the interventions you can see here include continuous positive airway pressure, or CPAP. So this is used to keep the upper airway open in those cases where the airway collapses during sleep. We also have non-invasive assisted ventilation, or NIV, and this is used when there is no drive to breathe, so when patients experience central apneas. These devices are able to generate breaths for the individual. In some cases where the upper airways may be narrow, or in cases where there is very severe scoliosis, then surgery may be recommended to try and improve breathing. On the individuals who hyperventilate, so that's a different problem, they often suffer from negative symptoms of having high CO2 in their blood. So as I mentioned before, either not breathing enough or having hyperventilation can shift your blood gases in directions that are harmful. So in the case of hyperventilation, the individuals can experience very low levels of CO2 in their blood, which can cause some symptoms like dizziness, but also muscle spasms, which could be confused with seizures. So in those cases, again, a handful of cases, CO2 has been successfully supplemented via an inhalation cannula or sometimes via rebreathing masks, and they can help abate those symptoms from low CO2. Although those devices are potentially very efficacious and devoid of side effects, not everyone tolerates them. So the drugs that have been shown in the literature to have some benefit for some individuals with Rett syndrome include drugs from a family called carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. So what those drugs are doing is mimicking the presence of normal levels of CO2 in the blood. It's actually tricking the brain into believing that there is more CO2 around, increasing the drive to breathe. So the other class of drugs that has been used are those drugs that mimic a brain chemical called serotonin. So serotonin is important for several brain functions, including the control of breathing. And there are studies in the literature, both in people with Rett syndrome, but also using the mouse models, indicating that drugs that act like 5-HT1A agonists, so those are drugs that bind and activate a certain receptor in the brain that's called 5-HT1A, have been shown to improve very severe, very acute episodes of breathing disturbance. Another class of drugs in that family are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So they increase the availability of natural serotonin that the brain is producing. They make it hang around for a bit longer so that it can act on its receptors. So this class of drugs have shown some benefit in the literature. It's also worth remembering that some drugs, not just the ones I've listed here, can have a negative impact on the heart rhythm. For neurotypical individuals, that's usually not really a problem. It's a very small effect and very unlikely to cause problems. But the heart rhythm of people with Rett syndrome shows already some baseline abnormalities in some cases, and people with Rett syndrome may be particularly vulnerable to the cardiac effect of these drugs. So this would be an adverse effect of these drugs. One example is fluoxetine has a high propensity to cause those problems. So when those drugs are being prescribed in people with Rett syndrome, it's really, really important to have a baseline assessment of the heart rhythm to make sure that individual already doesn't have a severe problem. And then again, a reassessment once the drug treatment is started to make sure that the drug is not tipping that vulnerability over the edge into a level where it could be problematic. Those types of heart abnormalities of heart rhythm caused by those drugs have been associated with a sudden cardiac death. So it's not something to be taken lightly. So today we learned that the incidence of breathing problems is high, but they can come and go during life. The severity of the breathing problems can also change with age, and particularly during key developmental stages like puberty and during menopause. So reassessments may be required and a rethinking of the treatment strategies with it. The awake, but particularly the sleep breathing dysfunctions are both manageable, and treating them may well improve other neurological symptoms. Although we still don't have direct evidence of this in the literature, it is sensible and reasonable to hypothesize that. However, when prescribing drugs, one should always mind the cardiac risk. So not just drugs to manage breathing, certain antibiotics also come with a cardiac risk. So this should always be taken in consideration when prescribing Rett syndrome, and assessments of cardiac risk before prescription and after are highly recommended. Finally, I would just like to highlight that other issues are often underestimated when it comes to the severity of the breathing disturbances. And through experience, we have found that a very sudden, severe exacerbation of the breathing disturbance can almost always be tracked back to either pain or a behavioral or an emotional issue. So we shouldn't really underestimate the effect of mood and emotion on the breathing disturbance in Rett syndrome. To finalize, I would like to acknowledge the funders and the collaborators who contributed to the research in my lab over the years. And also I would like to thank you for your attention.